Also, a lot of things have been purposely changed around that the kids don't really understand about. Pit did not happen in 1970 or 1980. That is not when the disaster happened. The disaster of Chernobyl actually happened in 1945 or 19 anywhere from 1930 to 1950. Basically, that's when Chernobyl happened. Um, and and like I said, I gave the order for the evacuation and all that other stuff. But the actual disaster and the fire and everything else that happened in Chernobyl actually happened in 1950 or 1930. Anywhere between 1930 and 1950. The idea that it actually was, I was basically already, in full swing by 1980. So and that, for some reason, has been largely been, I guess that would be considered top secret and classified. But like I say, the Hanford site was just a testing site and basically a plutonium reactor. It did not have any, and technically it was just a waste storage site or something like that for some strange reason. It did not have any, and would be considered like Nixon's cover up or something like that, where they were hiding stuff. Anyway, though, and possibly a meltdown or explosion or something like that. But but the Hanford site was not, I don't believe, was actually a manufacturing plant. Chernobyl was a manufacturing plant, and like I said, it became unsafe at some point in time. And like I said, it was abandoned by the Germans and me, or something like that, after like a robbery or something else like that, when the whole place became highly radioactive, where only the control rooms or some or or an outside control room. I think there might be like an off-site control room for the whole complex because it became just too dangerous. It was just too radioactive. So it was long since radioactive, long before 1980. Somewhere around 1930 or maybe even 1920 to 1930 to 1950 was when it was actually radioactive and actually caught fire several different times by people who did not know what they were doing. So anyway, I don't really know exactly. You'll have to talk to the Russians, ask Putin, ask the Chinese, ask some of the groups that were actually monitoring and watching and actually living it. I was not really living it so much as basically I knew of its existence. I mean, I paid for it. I directed it to be built and all that other stuff. So, and it was my city, my one of my White Star cities I was investing in and doing kind of. We could do it safely, or the Germans could do it safely. Other people could not do it. Other people or other groups could not do it safely, and like I say, which led to basically accidents happening at the site. And pretty much the reactors worked on lead, and I believe it was using lead to be melted down into something a little more fissionable or something like that, turning lead into something more valuable or something like that. The Germans could do it with great ease and very well. And like I say, if you look back, you'll find out that all the gauges, all the instrumentation in Chernobyl was all in German. So anyway, and then they had to be retranslated into Russian or something like that. So anyway, or something like that. Anyway, it was in a foreign language. Anyway, whatever. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff that's been covered up and considered, like I say, not national security and top secret because Nixon and JFK and a lot of the others were trying to get the radioactive material without actually having the site itself. Because I only had one big mass production site, which was Chernobyl, and technically the whole complex occupied like 6 different buildings, which were 6 different stages of the nuclear reaction cycle. Like I said, the whole site was basically one big nuclear reactor complex where nuclear fuel or lead would go from one to another to another to another to another to another to another, and basically be giving off fuel and being used up until it's basically depleted in the final stage or something like that. Anyway, I don't really know, and it's over a long period of time, and all of it's considered national security and top secret, and maybe has been burned. But you'll probably find the files in the Pentagon or maybe in the Kremlin or somewhere else like that. Like I said, many different groups were a part of these sites, so you'll find many duplicate copy records in both the Kremlin and the Pentagon, and even Germany itself. So, and I don't really care. But if you were wondering, yeah, it's like that. I think the best that I know. Anyway, and I don't really care. Like I say, my eyes hurt, my head hurts, and it's been too long, and it's just a big headache that I wish I never had anything to do with, but I did. So, anyway, and many people who had knowledge of Chernobyl would be like, "Oh, Chernobyl," and Chernobyl actually goes back to the early days of a turntable actually. The Chernobyl at its roots goes back to the old days when there was this big turntable, this great big huge like 1,000 foot or 100 foot turntable basically, and they would put the thorium, the uranium, and everything else on this big turntable, and it would go. You'd go from the storage site to basically the processing center. They would load it up on a turntable, and then they would rotate the turntable around, and it'd go. And then each section had lead lining, lead blocks, and keeping it all safe until I think the turntable caught fire or something like that. I forget exactly what happened to the turntable, but it was a turntable, and basically they would turn the uranium from the storage site out to the loading area via a big turntable, which had these lead lined little like ways where you'd load up the carriers onto the barrels onto this big turntable, and it would go and it would turn around to the loading dock, and then you could get your radiation cycle, your radioactive stuff. And basically, there's this big complex where there's radiation on the inside, and I think somewhat remote. I don't really remember. It was a long, long, long time ago, and goes back to the old turntable days. But if you see a turntable and it has lead lining and all this stuff, that's where it comes from. The old turntable or turntable days. When they had this lead lined turntable, they had this big turntable basically. And I believe it was like the size of like a couple buildings or something like that, where you would drive a forklift in and you would pick it up from one and take it out or something like that. I don't really remember, but there's this big turntable, and I liked it. I thought it was kind of cool because it kept the building separated and kept the workers safe. I think it was a lead lined turntable basically, where all the compartments were lead lined and the workers could be in relative ease and safely inside of this big turntable, which had these corridors which would access the different radioactive rooms, basically. So you could basically drive a forklift in and maybe pick up. I forget exactly how it worked. I don't know. But basically, it was a big turntable, and it had an operating, it looked like a submarine or something like that, where you'd go in and the driver would go, and it could rotate between one building and another building and the loading dock. So it just turned around in a big circle, I think. And that was a turnbili, because the uranium was in one section, the thorium was in another section, and basically there's these different buildings, I believe, and this one big lead-lined and leaded glass turntable where the operators could get inside and go in, and the place was radioactive, but inside the building was safe and you were fine. You'd only pick up a small amount of radiation, but outside the room and inside the warehouses, it was like highly radioactive. And basically, I think they had to use like remote equipment and stuff like that to actually pick up the cases and all that and deal with it inside the buildings or something like that. I don't really remember that much about it really, and you'll just have to look it up, to see about the old Chernobyl, which was this big thing I think that would turn around in a circle. It was like a big thingy, and get out my pen and paper if I got one real quick if we have time, which we kind of do off camera. It was like 4 buildings basically like this, I think, like that, and a loading area. And there's a big circle thing that would encompass all the buildings or something, and a control room, and I think a like thingy which was a elevator room. I think it was like this or something like that, except this was round, and like 4 different storage buildings or something like that. And there was like a control room, and a forklift could go between inside here. So this whole thing would rotate to the different rooms or the different storage buildings or something like that. I know it was a long time ago. It was like 1812 or 1200, where it was a big turnbili, and it was a big turntable with like a forklift. So a forklift could drive down, and it could drive like this way or something like that to 2 different warehouses or something like that, and then you could load it up onto a truck out here, and can you see that? You load it up into a truck out here on the loading dock, and it's called the turnbili or something like that. And I think it was old whatever. Anyway, it's something I owned basically, and it had minor amounts of radiation inside the turnbili, and then there's the 5 storage buildings, or the different storage buildings, one for each different radiation storage site basically, and there were like a couple different storage sites or something, all contained within a safety storage building basically, and the forklifts would go and then go into one building or the other building, and then the whole thing would go and then go and do that kind of maneuver, and then you'd drive out to your truck, or something like that. I don't really remember that much about it. So